If they had wanted to, those responsible could have brought help to the famished population, especially since it was a regional phenomenon. But that state and its representatives, the elite of the party, were more concerned with making sure that the famished people respected the norms of productivity on the collective farms. We have experienced food scarcity in Ukraine well after 1946 and 1947. For example, in 1964, all staples suddenly disappeared from all stores for almost a year.
How was the famine concealed?
Well, the Soviet regime at this time spared no effort it was doing in the countryside, and it was very important for it to do this. It was, first of all, exporting the grain to the West. There's a whole literature of Soviet grain dumping in this period, and it was important to them from an economic standpoint to deny that they were literally taking this grain, which they were selling, out of the mouths of starving people. Secondly, it was important for them to maintain a certain amount of sympathy in the West. And the maintenance of this sympathy itself was crucial to the concealment of the famine. The famine is part of a larger policy, which also extends to the cities, extends to the Ukrainian intelligentsia, to the Ukrainian political elite. That is, in this period, one witnesses the destruction of the Ukrainian cultural intelligentsia, of the spiritual intelligentsia, of the church, the removal of and destruction of many of the visible reminders of Ukraine's past. There's a literature on the lost architecture of Kiev, the destruction of Ukrainian politics in the Soviet Union. And all these things fit together in an attempt to break the Ukrainians as a social entity, a social organism, and a political factor within the context of the Soviet Union.
Who are the perpetrators of this famine?
Well, the main perpetrator, in my estimation, was Stalin. The policies which created the famine and which worsened it, which led it to its conclusion, were made in the highest circles of the Soviet political elite. That is the only place they could be made. The famine was the result of excessive grain procurement quotas against the Ukrainian Republic. These quotas seem to have been designed to break the countryside as a social basis of Ukrainian nationalism. It went hand in hand with a massive purge of the Ukrainian cultural elite, with the destruction of the Communist Party of Ukraine, or at least of its Ukrainian wing, the destruction of Ukrainian politics. Ukraine is a political factor inside the Soviet Union.
And yet there's an awful lot of these people who have perpetuated this crime still walking the streets of Moscow. Who are these people?
Many of them are still in the political leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Under Khrushchev and since his time, Soviet scholars have talked about, or scholars of the Soviet Union in the West have talked about the so-called Dnipropetrovsk Mafia. That is the elite that was brought to power on Khrushchev's coattails, including Brezhnev, were Donbass Russians. And these are the people who took part in creating the famine. It's the same group which provided the Ukrainian countryside with these thousanders, with these plenipotentiaries which took out the grain. I mean, the people, if you ask what happened to the people who committed any Ukrainian genocide, the answer is that they are in power in the Soviet Union today.
Stalin devoted himself to that system, to which we have all participated. I would even say that Stalin was the most diabolical, and all those that surrounded him, Kaganovich, Voroshilov, Molotov, they were all diabolical. I was also part of that group. I was young and stupid. We have all created that system.
I think the difference between Lenin and Stalin was quantitative, but not qualitative. Stalin killed many more people than Lenin had, but Lenin was prepared to kill his political opponents as well. It wasn't a difference of philosophy. It was a matter of Stalin's greater efficiency as a murderer.
Людина шукає, бо знає, що можна знайти. За чим вона шукає? За свободою, за ідеалами, за чимось високим?
An individual looks for what he knows he may be able to find. He isn't looking for freedom or ideals, but food. He is lowered to the state of an animal who will lick the hand of whoever has given him food. This is a tragedy. It means that many generations of a population are led strictly by their physiological needs. In other words, they are led by their stomach.
Від того, що вони для задоволення своїх фізіологічних потреб мають. Виявляються залежними від свого шлунку, фактично. Отже, в періоди голоду, коли фактично відсутні харчі, і їх майже неможливо здобути, в той час загроза фізичного існування населення, загроза для фізичної субстанції нації.
Il y a une certaine analogie de l'exploitation de la population de l'Ukraine par le centre Moscou.
Moscow considered and treated Ukraine as a colony. The famine in Russia was real. There was a genuine lack of food. There was a lack of food in Ukraine as well as in Russia. The government chose to sacrifice the population of Ukraine, but since they're to help the population of Russia.
Why is the United Nations ignorant?
Well, it's a political reason. The Soviet Union has always sought to align itself with the Third World. And it creates a certain bloc in the Soviet Union. And in the Third World, people look at reality. The Soviet Union is always saying, we're anti-imperialists, we're against the colonialists, meaning the people who in the past exploited these Third World nations. And there is an old saying that the devil you know always appears worse than the devil you don't know. Well, they know the devil of Western imperialism. And it may be something that is now a part of history because the Western empires have broken up. But they do not have any direct experience with Soviet imperialism. So it is very easy for them to assume that since the Soviet Union is saying, we are your friends, it is easy for them to assume that that is in fact the case.
И вот отношение интеллигенции сейчас осознание своей ошибки. То есть очень многие писатели, скажем,
The intelligentsia starts to realize its mistake. Among the most reputed writers, Alexander Twardowski, the editor of Novy Mir, who had written a poem in praise of collectivization, saw his own father depossessed of his land and deported. He later understood that all this was unnecessary and in fact had led to catastrophe. It means that the intelligentsia, in my opinion, had a guilt complex, and a well-justified one. They understand that their behavior, or that of their fathers, had been at least faulty, if not criminal.
Близких им людей, вот того поколения и отчасти ее поколения, было ошибочно, если не преступно.
Most Western intellectuals, British, French, German, Canadian, American, were pro-Soviet. Stalin said that he was engaged in a great noble experiment for the benefit of all mankind, and they believed him. The primary responsibility for this lay, of course, with Stalin. He began a deliberate campaign of misinforming the West, of suppressing, concealing the facts about the famine as much as possible. This is not surprising. He had good reasons to do so. It was in his own interest to suppress the facts. What is surprising, however, is that institutions in the West, including reputable newspapers, and major Western governments went along with this. And helped Stalin, in effect, to conceal the fact that millions of people had died or were dying. Now, when I say major institutions, including newspapers, I have in mind specifically the New York Times, which went along with what Stalin was doing, and whose reporter in Moscow, Walter Duranty, in my view, deliberately misrepresented the facts. I would put it even more strongly. I would say he knowingly lied. Now, another example of this kind of a deliberate cover-up is the British government. I've had an opportunity to study the archival records, and it is clear that in the course of 1933, Whitehall, the British government in London, informed in great detail about what was going on in Ukraine. British embassy and consular officials in Moscow were sending back detailed dispatches, week by week, day by day, describing ghastly things. It was no secret to people in London, to officials in London, that there was a famine going on, and as some put it, that perhaps as many as 10 million people had died. The same Whitehall officials who had been receiving these reports about the famine situation and agreeing that they were true, now called this an alleged famine. This was the word they used, alleged famine, and said, sorry, we cannot do anything because we have normal relations with the Soviet Union.